for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
(1972) to the year 2000, 28 event-packed years. We struggled to make sense of this period. We're historians. We're past-haunted creatures, you know, and we keep looking back. And do we have a responsibility to immediately assess, almost like a reporter does, the swirling events of our time?
They say journalists write the first draft of history, which there's some truth to that, meaning the newspaper reports. And I think historians, contemporary historians, do the next draft.
Although I write sometimes on contemporary issues that have a historical dimension, I don't find what is called contemporary history very interesting.
The most interesting kind of history is the history that does get at the pain and value of human experience, and it explains not just what happened, but what people do with what happens.
The fundamental issue in history is to provide historical perspective, to provide context, to provide a certain kind of understanding.
Historians look at the last quarter of the 20th century. Today, on a Biography of America. On July 4th, 1976, America commemorated its bicentennial. It was an auspicious anniversary. Although few people knew it at the time, the very character of the country was changing. Gerald Ford was president. He had taken office 3 years earlier when a discredited President Richard Nixon resigned rather than face impeachment.
Resign the presidency effective
at the time of this political crisis, America was also in the grip of the energy crisis. In 1972, you could buy gas for 40 cents a gallon. A year later, you'd be paying double that. And the energy crisis triggered a long-term recession. Some of the country's biggest industries, like the auto industry and the steel industry, were hit hard. Plants laid off hundreds of thousands of workers, and once prosperous industrial cities like Pittsburgh and Detroit were in terrible trouble. The Cold War persisted, with tensions and defense budgets running high. This is where America was in 1980. If we fast forward the picture to the late 1990s, it could not have been more different. The economy is booming. The Cold War is over. America is riding high as the leader of a global economy and a global culture. These changes occurred with dramatic, head-turning suddenness, and it's hard to make sense of them, to put them into historical perspective. We're too close to what happened. Yet we have a responsibility as historians to make sense of the history of our own times. Let's look at some of this history through the headlines from the years 1972 to the year 2000. Neither Gerald Ford nor Jimmy Carter, who took office as president in 1977, could reverse America's economic decline. Carter warned that there were limits to growth, that Americans had to reduce their expectations.
Tonight I want to have an unpleasant talk with you about a problem that's unprecedented in our history.
It was a sober time. In 1979, a nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania threatened a meltdown of the plant and raised fears about the catastrophic potential of all nuclear power. At the end of the Jimmy Carter presidency, 52 Americans had been taken hostage by Iranian terrorists.
The United States of America will not yield to international terrorism.
They were released in 1981, the day Ronald Reagan took office. By the time Reagan became president, the country's economic problems seemed to be entrenched.
The interest on the public debt this year, we know, will be over $90 billion.
Reagan and the Republican Congress moved quickly to institute tax cuts and cut government programs. Still, the economic recession continued. Unemployment reached 10% in 1982.
We hadn't seen the bottom. It hadn't bottomed out yet.
President Reagan increased the defense budget dramatically, attacking the Soviet Union as the evil empire.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire.
Reagan called for a supercharged American effort to defeat the enemy. The Soviet Union, however, was beginning its own transformation under Mikhail Gorbachev, a president committed to democratic reforms. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, long the symbol of the Cold War, collapsed, and along with it, within several years, the Soviet Union. The first cases of AIDS appeared in America in 1981. By 1988, the disease threatened to become an epidemic. The AIDS quilt expressed the grief of thousands of Americans for the epidemic's victims. In the 1980s, concern about the environment grew, especially in response to the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska's Prince William Sound. More than 10 million barrels of oil contaminated hundreds of miles of shoreline and shattered the local ecosystem. In 1983, Sally Ride became the first American woman in space, spending 6 days in orbit. She was among the many women whose place in society had changed dramatically in the last quarter of the 20th century. This was a period of fabulous technological achievement.
The 25th Space Shuttle...
By the mid-1980s, the launching of a space shuttle was a regular event, until the tragic explosion of the Challenger in 1986.
We have no downlink.
In the biological sciences, recombinant DNA technology, a first step in cloning, was developed. In the early 1980s, the first personal computer hit the market, and the first clumsy connections on the internet were made in 1982. Ronald Reagan restored the confidence of America, and his economic policies, trickle-down economics, created a whole new class of millionaires. Those who had money spent it, and spent it lavishly. The 1980s came to be seen as the me decade, a decade of excess.
One of the great things about this nation is that we can seek profit, and I'm proud of that. If you can gain profit, that's even better.
But the gap between rich and poor, whites and people of color, city and suburbs, continued to grow. And so did conservatism in politics and in culture. George Bush was elected president in 1988, inheriting both the optimism of the Reagan years and the problems in the American economy. By 1992, the federal deficit was $4 trillion.
We need jobs. This is not going to work.
The long siege of economic troubles had deep roots. Fueled by racism, they ignited the Los Angeles riots. In early 1991, an aroused nation united behind President Bush when he attacked the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein after Hussein invaded Kuwait. The Persian Gulf War was an overwhelming demonstration of American technological might. In November 1992, William Jefferson Clinton was elected president, despite rumors of personal scandal that would plague his presidency and culminate in his impeachment in December 1998. Yet during his 8 years as president, the country experienced an unrivaled economic boom. The stock market climbed to an all-time high and was still climbing at the end of the century. America had become a service economy with its biggest exports, entertainment, information technologies, and its own culture. By the year 1998, over 40 million households had their own personal computers. More than 11 million had more than 3 televisions, and 44 million Americans had guns. The complexion of the country continued to change. By 1998, 72% of the population was white, 12% African American, 11% Hispanic, and 4% Asian. New technologies transformed virtually every aspect of life, even our own genetic makeup. By the year 2000, the Human Genome Project was nearing completion of the map of the entire human DNA code, offering staggering possibilities for altering the design of life itself. In the year 2000, America stood poised to take on the challenges of the third millennium.
The torch is passed to a new century of young Americans.
These are the headlines. They're raw data, and it's an incomplete set of data at that. I asked our team of historians to interpret, to shed some light on these events. At first, they resisted.
How do you write about a period through which you lived? Because that shapes our perspective as to what is important, what isn't important, our own experiences. And the recent past isn't just writing about, the 1990s or the 1980s. Some of us have memories of the 70s, the 60s, and the 50s. Well, that's half a century of history about which we have personal memories. You know, our own identities were shaped by these memories. But when we go to choose what's important, how much are we drawn to those, not because of our detached role as historians, but because we're engaged personally with the past. But it raises questions about the tension between the role as historian and the role as participant.
Historians have always had agendas. They've always had emotional and ideological agendas.
I'm not talking about it as an agenda in a negative sense. I'm talking about it as a set of issues that becomes raised, that comes to the very question of a tendency to identify things as being important, not as a predictive value, but which later down the line you're not going to feel are important. And why are you going to predict them or pretend that they're important? Because you lived through them, you experienced them, right? We all would have thought that Newt Gingrich and the Republican ascendancy would have been this momentous moment, and look how quickly it passed. At the moment living through it, we would have offered one interpretation. 2 years later, we would have offered another.
And the other thing is that when you work from newspapers, a period you live through, every day has an equal headline. When you're a historian, you shuffle those in some way. You rank them. Some you forget, some you emphasize. That's difficult to do until you study a period that has not only a past, but a future.
A period that not only has a past, but a future. It's an interesting idea. We can't yet see the future of the last 25 years of the century, but we do have some perspective on the first 75 years. I asked our historians to look at the history of recent times in light of the 20th century as a whole. America in 1900 was seen as it was a confident place. It was a place where crisis was seen as an opportunity, and it was a nation, we were a nation known for making things. We were a nation known for our ceaseless change, the material change, the change in nationalities. It was a country in constant turmoil, but we seemed to have this confidence that we could solve these kinds of, any problem that presented itself. What kind of country are we now? How have we changed? This has been a raucous century, an unbelievable century.
I think people would find that democracy has prevailed in this century in very many fundamental ways. It's been a bloody century. I mean, we've had to fight the Kaiser, we've had to fight Nazism, totalitarianism, communism, and at the end of the century, democracy, or American-style democracy, seems to be stronger and more vigorous than ever. At the same time, it's been the century of a struggle to bring more people into that democracy. I think the women's rights movement, the right to vote for 1920 and on for equal rights, equal pay, has been pronounced and something positive. And I think in civil rights, there have been extraordinary breakthroughs beginning in 1950s and into the 60s with the signing of the Civil Rights Acts with Lyndon Johnson, that people could start seeing our democratic experiment is moving forward, that more people are taking part of it.
I think there's this extraordinary momentum in the 50s and the 60s where through civil rights and through a whole range of social movements, people felt they could take control over their lives and that they could form movements and make change. And I think a lot of it goes to where do you think you can make change? If change needs to be made, can it be made in the political system? I think a lot of people feel that the political system is corrupt. It goes to whoever has the most money. And it strikes me that that is very important, you know, where in their own lives people think they can make a difference.
I think Waldo's point about people trying to make change in the 50s and 60s, the pace of social life has sped up so much as a consequence of information revolution, as a consequence of transformation of the working and family lives of everyone, that people now, I think, are making those changes while coping with enormous change. Since the 1970s, we've had an incredible revolution in family life in this country. Most children under the age of 5 in the United States have mothers who work. And in 1970, that wasn't true. That was an enormous revolution in terms of who's available in the workforce, in terms of what the landscape looks like. It changes everything.
It changed so dramatically, I suspect it's very difficult to imagine for young people how much it was assumed that a woman would stay at home with her children in the 50s and even the 60s. People who were going the other direction were swimming against the stream.
It's a huge change. When you think in 1900, in the garment industry in New York, women worked, but Italian women that worked in that industry were single Italian women.
Yes.
The minute they married, as much as they needed the money, they went home.
And think of how difficult it was for school teachers. You could teach when you were married, when you were single, but as soon as you married, you lost your job.
So a lot of those school teachers didn't tell. Pardon? They didn't tell. They kept their marriages secret through the Depression because they were the first ones fired. Now you wouldn't think that a woman would have to quit her job when she's married. In fact, mostly you want to keep your job so that you can have that kind of ideal two-income family that will bring the benefits of the mushrooming consumer economy home to your entire family. If you look at the fact that the fastest growing family type in the United States by the end of the 20th century was a single woman and her children, and that those were families disproportionately below the poverty line, then you have a problem that maybe the government ought to do something about it.
But this is also one of the themes, I think, of the century. If you take the long look, that's changed dramatically. I mean, Americans have always had an on-again, off-again relationship with respect to the role that they think government should play in their lives. And when you think about the striking transformation in the last quarter of this century, where this argument has been that government is too big, let's get government off of the backs of people, let's return power back to the states, the kind of new states' rights, the new federalism that has taken place, it marks a tremendous shift at the end of the century from earlier in the century when, of course, during the Great Depression and during other periods, the whole idea was that that was the role of government, was the responsibility of government to play an integral role in people's lives. I think this is a crucial theme for the sweep of the century.
I think one of the functions of government is to make life for those at the bottom better. And I don't think you can think about a federal government just sort of like making sure that the pot doesn't boil over. I think the government has to have some sort of a way to deal and to sustain, to support, and to make life better for those at the bottom. It strikes me that if you don't deal with the kinds of issues that inequality produces, then this society won't continue to exist. I don't think that just because we're wealthy and we are dominant that we will always be.
What do you mean, continue to exist?
I mean, continue to exist as sort of the dominant power that will always control everything. You know, empires rise and fall. And I don't see any reason to think that the United States will always be dominant. And it strikes me that what you have to deal with are the core issues undermining the democracy.
But there are foreign policy issues, and I think that what you're saying is true, but from 1945 to really 2000, the key was dealing with the external world, dealing with the Soviet Union. We're in the middle of a Cold War. All that money you're talking about, who should get it from the federal government? Well, 3/4 of it was going to fight the Cold War. It was going to the military in the United States.
But this is part of the problem that Waldo's talking about. When we have, on the one hand, this ideal of democracy, and on the other hand, this dissonance, this tension with the realities of growing inequality. I mean, the statistics about inequality in America at the end of the 20th century are staggering. You know, I mean, it's just growing and growing and growing. You talk about people being alienated and disaffected from the political system. Well, when you're poor and you have a system that no longer is providing, or an ideology that no longer says it's the responsibility of the government to help you. You know, we're back to that old individualism.
It is.
Do you have to, do you have to help yourself? And by what means can you help yourself?
Yeah, well, one of my friends, self-help is the capitalism of fools. I mean, you know, if you don't have if you don't have the wherewithal to help yourself, how are you going to help yourself?
I think with history, you get a perspective on things that can affect public policy. For example, poverty is different today than it was in 1900. There were more opportunities for unskilled people, and there was a transportation system in a city to take unskilled people from ghetto to factory. And today you take a large city, there's a tremendous concentration of minorities in that large city. The jobs have moved to the suburbs. And typical city like Detroit, 1/3 of the black households in Detroit do not have cars. There's no way to get to those jobs.
But I think the question, when you talk about all these urban, who's in these cities, it strikes me that any of the major cities, LA, places, these are fundamentally third world cities. You're talking about cities where the population, as we go forward, you know, are sort of like ringed by white and, you know, increasingly diverse suburbs, but they're functionally third world.
Los Angeles is not a third world city.
I think it functionally is. I think when you,
I don't think so. I think it's one of the capitals of the world.
It is, but I think when you talk about the people who constitute the population.
What is powering LA in the direction that you're talking about? You've got to understand what caused it to become what it is. If you're going to continue it or stop it.
We're talking about patterns of immigration.
Yeah.
And since 1965, you had enormous shifts in terms of communities of color and population streams of color, you know, Asians, Latin Americans, Africans coming to this country, really transforming a lot of population centers. And
what does this have to do with the history thing?
It has everything to do with it, because I think one of the problems that we confront as we go toward wherever we're going is who we are. And it strikes me that we are no longer who we thought we were.
Exactly. We are a multicultural society. If we haven't melted into the melting pot metaphor, we're certainly interacting with different ways. The influx of Asian immigrants and Hispanic immigrants, to the point that in the 21st century, you're going to have America that's, you know, close to 50% non-white, which is, I think, something that's quite extraordinary.
In the 50s, you could represent this nation as white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, and male. And we can no longer think about ourselves like that. What we are has been created on the back of a lot of oppression, a lot of difficult times for a lot of working people, poor people, and people of color, and women. And what I think we need to do is focus on the struggle, at least as part of a dual narrative. It strikes me that you can't just have America triumphant, that you also have to have sort of like what has informed that triumph.
As we talked, I could see my colleagues struggling with their own passionately held perspectives. Each of us has to come to terms with the past, both as historians and as the memory-haunted creatures we are.
Don, like you, I came to history through newspapers. But I have to say, as a historian, although I write sometimes on contemporary issues that have a historical dimension, I don't find what is called contemporary history very interesting. It doesn't have the complexity of an earlier period, but more than that, I've always thought of history as having a humanistic dimension. It was to understand what it is to be somebody else. And it isn't at all challenging to know what it is to be somebody I am, or where I've known other people. It's less of a challenge.
You know, Pauline, I want to stand up for the contemporary historians among us here for a minute, because I don't feel like when I write about the United States at this point, I'm writing about who I am. I feel like I'm writing about the kind of diverse array of people that Waldo is talking about here, and trying to take account of those experiences. And the kind of rapid change that we have, it seems to me, bespeaks a complexity that's every bit as compelling and every bit as difficult to get your head around as the kind of complexity that comes into play when you're trying to make a country out of 13 colonies.
Part of the process, right, is to recover these stories, but it's not enough just to tell them, because all we do is tell them. We're not historians, we're antiquarians, and we're just chronicling events without putting them into any order or lending any interpretation to them. The most interesting kind of history is the history that does get at the pain and value of human experience, and it explains not just what happened, but what people do with what happens, what it means.
Yes. I think history can be just as good as great fiction in that regard, in illuminating character and illuminating the tragedy of the human condition and what it's like to be alive on this earth.
You know, there's an aphorism that I think says a lot about what we do, and the aphorism is that the only thing that's certain is the future, because the past is constantly changing.
Once our history was what white men did in the daylight. Now it's what happens to other people while we watch. We are at times just curious, an Oscar or a Super Bowl. We are at times compelled, a Watergate or Berlin Wall. We may hope at exalted moments like a moonshot, and on dreadful occasions like an assassination, to experience community as a nation. But mostly we just sit there, hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, needing novelty or distraction, gossip or laughs, remedial seriousness or vulgar celebrity, a place to celebrate and a place to mourn, a circus and a wishing well. This is a mixed curse. On the one hand, as never before, we are privileged with the best seat in the House for coronations and impeachments, civil rights and civil riots, earthquakes, OJ and Vietnam. As if looking down from a Zeppelin, our vantage is superior to the fixed positions of official participants and court historians, with multiple views of the action, an intimate focus or broad scan, and an IV feed of raw data and expert chit-chat on demand by royal whim. On the other hand, TV has stolen our memory, yours and mine. It's gone to another bank. I was a student at Berkeley in the early 60s, but the images in my head are Mario Savio's and Ronald Reagan's, not my own. I reported from Chicago on the Democratic Convention of 1968, but the cassette in my head is Abby Hoffman's. I marched in favor of integration and against war, but the tapes in my head are Eyes on the Prize. On the third hand, and there's always a third hand, we are agnostics about reality itself. We've been docudramatized and Dutched, as if every narrative, however problematic, had been dumbed down to love gone wrong. And while TV sells us cars by promising adventure and sells us beer by promising friendship, it also robs us of chronology. With channels for weather, food, history, nostalgia, cartoons, and porn, we see everything that ever was, all at the same time, and increasingly remote. How come, while television has told us over and over again to be nicer to women, children, minorities, immigrants, poor people, sick people, old people, odd people, and strangers, the nation got so mean?
For information about A Biography of America, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org. Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.